Good morning again, everyone. I'm Professor Barlow Dermagrdician of the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State. I'd like to welcome you to this presentation of the fall lecture series of the Armenian Studies program. Good morning again, everyone. I'm Professor Barlow Dermagrdician of the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State. I'd like to welcome you to this presentation of the fall lecture series of the Armenian Studies program. And so we are going to today take a very fascinating look into the story of a new book called A Woman of the World, Armen Ohanian, the Dancer of Shamakha, presented by the two authors, Vartan Matiossian and Bakhchinyan. Today, after the presentation, you'll have an opportunity for you to present and discuss questions. So if you have questions during the presentation today, I'd like to invite you to write them in the chat, and then we'll open that up afterwards to do that. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly share a PowerPoint of some of our upcoming events, some of the upcoming events of the Armenian Studies program. Let me do that in just a moment here. So these are our October events that are upcoming. Our next lecture is going to be on Friday, October the 7th, called Armenians and Other Armenians in Contemporary Turkey. That's actually the name of the three-part series of lectures, which is going to be given by our Kazan visiting professor in Armenian Studies, Dr. Hrag Papazian. These will be in-person lectures, but we are streaming them on YouTube. So if you're not in the immediate area, obviously you can follow it on YouTube. And his lecture will be on Muslim and Alevi Armenians. This is going to be a very interesting lecture, continuing on his first lecture, which was just held last week, which discussed the question of Armenianness and identity in contemporary Turkey. Our next lecture following that will be on Thursday, October the 13th, when Ian Nagoski and Harut Arakelian will be speaking about the Armenian-American soprano Zabel Panosyan, who was born in 1891 and died in 1986. She is well known for her recordings, and they will bring with them early 20th century recordings of Zabel Panosyan. And she actually has a Fresno connection as well, because she traveled through Fresno and recorded several of her songs in Fresno. And then finally in October, we will have a talk called A House in the Homeland, Armenian Pilgrimages to Places of Ancestral Memory, by Dr. Carol Bertram, who's a professor emerita of San Francisco State University. And she will be talking about her experiences visiting historic Armenia, pilgrimages to historic Armenia that were taken by both her and a lot of other Armenians and non-Armenians who were traveling to that area with the Armen Ohanian visits. And she'll be talking about this because it's a new book that she's also written. So that will be on Thursday, October the 20th, here at Fresno State as well. So let's talk today about our presentation. It's going to be a fascinating look at the life of Armen Ohanian, born in 1888 and passed away in 1976. She was a well-educated woman born into an Armenian family in the Caucasus and truly was a woman of the world. Today, our speakers will talk about this work, and little did they realize, as they write in the preface to the book, that this would be a 2 decades long journey, more than 20 years that the authors have been working on the study of this woman. And in the process, both Vartan Matiossian and Bakhchinyan have examined both her own writings, because she also was an author, but have looked at other primary sources, archival recordings, records, and newspapers, and have looked at extensive secondary literature in many, many languages. Just to name a few: Armenian, Russian, Spanish, and English, primary languages, but also languages such as German, Italian, Swedish, etc., where she traveled or her work was written about. So it's really a fascinating journey that we're going to take today with our speakers. So I'd like to introduce our two speakers. The format will be, we're going to be sharing a PowerPoint, and both speakers will be speaking about the PowerPoint, but really about the life of Armen Ohanian. Vartan Matiossian is a historian and a literary scholar with a broad range of interests in Armenian classical and modern culture. and he has published extensively in Armenian, Spanish, and English, including 8 books and almost 24 translations, and has several edited volumes. He's currently the executive director of the Eastern Prelacy of the Armenian Church in New York. Joining us from Yerevan is Artzvi Bakhchinyan, who's a scholar specializing in the history of the Armenian diaspora and culture, as well as being a writer and a translator. And he is the author, editor, and translator of some 20 books, and has been a frequent contributor to journals and periodicals in Armenian, Russian, and English. He is currently a researcher at the Institute of History at the National Academy of Sciences of Armenia. I'd like to welcome both of them and thank them for presenting this book, which has actually just been published by the press at the Fresno State. And I will put in the chat toward the end where you can purchase the book. It is volume 16 in the Armenian series of the press at California State University, Fresno. So I'd like to welcome Vartan and Artzvi. And Artzvi, I think we have to ask you to unmute. I think I accidentally muted you. So you can just unmute yourself, and then I will share the PowerPoint and we'll begin our presentation. Thank you both, Vartan and Artzvi.
Thank you, Barlo, for that introduction. I just wanted to start to point out that, as you said, this project was 2 decades in the making. And of course, when we started, we just thought of joining our interests and efforts because on one side, I was interested and I was working at the time in the early 2000s on the Armenian communities of Latin America. And of course, because Armen Ohanian spent the second half of her life in Mexico, where she died. So she was a part of my interest. And on the other side, Artzvi had a lifelong, let's say, interest in people of Armenian origins, on which he had written extensively. So we thought of going together on this one. And first we thought of writing just an article, you know, a 20 pages standard article in Armenian that would do the trick. But then when we started writing, sources started piling up to the point that the little article became a book. And we first published a book in Armenian in 2007, which is now out of print, 224 pages. And those of you who already have the English book may notice that this English book is double the size of the Armenian. And it's, of course, a book written from scratch, not a translation, because of the sheer volume of the material which came up in the next about 15 years, and the effort that demanded from us to put together all that information into a single cohesive book. So this is how this book came to its end, and there are many anecdotes and stories about the things that we found and the things that we didn't find. Just to mention one, to which Barlo was a witness, was that until the beginning of this year, when we were on the last correction of the book, we still maintained that had the date 1887 as the date of birth of Armen Ohanian, because there is a very funny stories about her age. So, which was the date provided by the Armenian Soviet Encyclopedia. And at the beginning of this year, our friend Dr. Carlos Santaramian from Mexico, he provided us with another set of documents from Mexican archives, and there we found proof on some documentation regarding her marriage that she wrote that it was written there, and she signed it that she was born in 1888. So at that point is when we were forced to change the date of birth. So at the last minute, we still even hope that we will find, you know, her actual date of death, but that didn't happen yet. But one day it will happen, sure. I'm sure that it will. So.
I would like to add that writing this book was a big adventure. Likewise, Armen Ohanian's own life was kind of big adventure through the centuries, through the epochs, through the languages and cultures. So when we published the Armenian version, and since it has summaries in English, French, Russian, Spanish, and Farsi, we decided to put all this information on Wikipedia, and we were surprised that from non-Armenian circles, we received many uh, interest toward this lady, and in time the number of languages increased, and now there are some 21 languages, if I'm not mistaken, of her biography in Wikipedia. That even there are among those languages such for instance, Erzia language, there are some 5,000 people speaking this language, but you see, many are being fascinated by extraordinary and very colorful biography of Armen Ohanian. So that's why we decided that it's worthy to initiate a big full-fledged biography in English. Yeah, because Armen Ohanian seemed one of the rare personalities, not in Armenian history only, but also, well, in women's history, let's say, who seems endless, you know, she's endless. I'm pretty sure that after this book, new discoveries are waiting for us that still we are not aware, because those paper traces that she left all around the world cannot be, yeah, collected at once. Even 20 years is a long time, but still, I highly hope, for instance, that in Mexico, her personality, her biography will interest some people. And as we have some enthusiasts of Armen Ohanian in Armenia, in France, maybe some Mexicans will help us to find finally her personal files and maybe her grave. Don't you think, Vartan?
It's possible that the archives come out from some place. We really don't know uh, where they are at this point. We are not even sure where she passed away. We have an idea of where she was about 7 years before her death, but in the 70s her traces were lost. We couldn't find any single reference of her during that time, and the date of her death is almost kind of conventional, because again it's a date that was provided in the Soviet Armenian Encyclopedia, and but that's the best we have as a possible source. So there is still a lot to discover about this extraordinary woman, and we will see in the next few minutes why she was so extraordinary, at least from our viewpoint. Barlo, please go forward. So Armen Ohanian was born, as we said, in Shamakha or Shamakhi in 1888, and she passed away in Mexico in 1976. Mexico meaning the country, not necessarily the Mexico City. And for those who can see on the map, Shamakha or Shamakhi is located at the time of Armen Ohanian's birth. it was located in a country that didn't exist, which is now called Azerbaijan. Interestingly, as we have shown in the first few pages of the book, Shamakha was at times considered to be part of Armenia, not even of in the Caucasus or part of Iran, but specifically mentioned by non-Armenian sources as far as the 14th century as part of Armenia. And even Armen Ohanian herself, in her first memoir, she mentioned that Shamakha was a principality in Armenia. So that's an interesting little point. And of course, needless to say to all of you, that Azerbaijan doesn't even know that Armen Ohanian existed today. You can go and look, and we did, in some Azeri, for instance, one Azeri website dedicated to Shamakha, and of course there is no mention of any Armenians. There are some Azeri cultural figures, which are unknown to me at least, mentioned as people born there, but of course no Armenian, despite the fact that there were several famous people born in Shamakha. So Armen Ohanian, as we said, she was an actress, a theater director, a writer, a political activist, and a dancer. First and foremost, she was a dancer, and she was her life, she was going from the Caucasus to Mexico. All that spans of 3 continents she covered during her life, and what a life she had. I mean, it's in that period she was a witness to the Armenian massacres in Baku in 1905. Then she was in Iran during the Iranian Constitutional Revolution. Then she was in Europe during the Belle Epoque, the last years before World War I. Then she was in the post-war year again in Europe, and then she visited first the United States in the Roaring '20s, and then she was in the Soviet Union in the first years after the Soviet Revolution, and then she was in Mexico at the time when a few years after the Mexican Revolution. So she was a witness and a participant sometimes in these many events. And of course, then it wasn't just her life that we are chronicling in this book, but also a lot of world history and world culture, which was there because not only she was there at the time of these events, but she also interacted with so many people that are well known outside of Armenian of the Armenian realm.
And the next one, please. The next. Yeah. And Shamakha was famous by his dancers, orchards, and earthquakes. So we don't know about the orchards, but the dancers, who were, of course, Persians, had influenced on Armen Ohanian, who was born Sofia Pirbudagyan. There are some paintings of Russian artists, especially those of Gregory Gagarin, painting those famous bayadères of Orient. And already in 1870, a French author has written a book called Les Danseuses de Shamakha, which later became the title of the first book of Armen Ohanian. Yes, dances and earthquake also had influence on her life. Her family moved from Shamakha after the earthquake of 1902, when it destroyed the city, and the family moved to Baku. The next, please.
So when she moved to Baku, she finished her school there. she was actually shifting between Baku and Shamakha at the time. Her father, Emmanuel Pivudarian, was first a Lutheran pastor, and then he was also an educator. Um, and apparently he was also an oilman later. And she finished school in 1905, the same year. Next one, Barlow, please. No, this one. So in 1905, when she finished school, she got married with her school sweetheart, Armen Ohanian, who was a university student at the time and a lifelong university student. He finished his medical school about 58 years old, and he was also an activist of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. So she married to him in 1905, and I honor about that time. Her family was ruined during the third massacre of Baku in October 1905, and her father died there, and the family got ruined. And then she went with her husband to Iran, in the city of Rasht in northern Iran, and she was there until they separated a few months later. And in the meantime, they had a daughter called Nora, who was born in 1906. So what you see in the picture is Nora de Rohanian's Mexican immigration card, which is an interesting piece of information when she immigrated from Berlin to Mexico in the 30s, because of course it provides information about her, but also indirectly about her mother too. So at this time, 1905, 1906, Armen Ohanian was a very inquisitive and well-read and well-studied girl who finished the Russian gymnasium, and she was ready to start her career or pursue her interest as an actress, which was her first interest about 1905 when she first, in circumstances that are still not totally clear, she made her debut at the age of 17 in Nora Hichevan in a play presented there. Next, please.
And it's important to note that as many traditional Armenian families, Sofia's family was also against that their daughter become an actress. But because she was ahead of her time and she was very sure about her future, she said that she will marry, and if her husband also will be against her being an actress, she will divorce and totally dedicate herself to theater.
And we don't know if her husband was against theater. Apparently he was, but it's not exactly, it's a one-sided sword, so we don't know about that. But in the end, she separated from him. She got the divorce much later, and it's not clear how she did it, because the Armenian church doesn't give divorces. So in any case, she started her career as an actress in Baku in 1906, and she played in Baku until 1908. We see here the oldest picture we have of her from 1908. You can see her at the center of the picture, surrounded by her colleagues in a play they played, by the way, in Nakhichevan, of all places. So when today we remember that Nakhichevan, there are no Armenians, and the Armenian cultural monuments have been ruined by Azerbaijan, let's remember that 100 years ago there was a flourishing Armenian presence in Nakhichevan. So in 1908, Armen Ohanian decides to go and study in Moscow, and she enrolls in the world famous Moscow Art Theater, which had been founded by Konstantin Stanislavski, the author of the Stanislavski method. So she first started studying there, and then she studied dance at a former Bolshoi dancers private academy. And she had presentations in Moscow as a soloist. And during those presentations is when she adopted the surname Armen Ohanian. And of course, this is a kind of confusing thing because, as we all know, Armen is usually a male name among us. But it's not. It hasn't been always a male name alone, right, Arti?
So let me mention here that according to her contemporaries, she was not as interesting as actress, especially her voice was not so relevant for the stage. We know that in 19th century, the so-called good voice was very important for the stage, but because her movements, her plastic uh, character was very obvious, she was advised to attend dance classes, and thus she became probably the first Armenian female dance who received a professional choreographic education. Uh, the next, please. Yeah. And her appearing in Persia gave her opportunity to study Persian dances and give dance recitals. The Persian dances were something unknown to the Western world, and it was surprised that after learning Persian dances, she worked as a theater director, becoming the pioneer of the first European style theater in Persia, staging Nicholas Gogol's famous play, The Government Inspector, in Farsi language. And it's interesting that she doesn't know this language, but she managed to act in this play. And the Persian government decorated her for her work in theater. And as usual, the local Armenians were against her theatrical performances in Persian theater. So they started to persecute her, and she attempted to commit a suicide. Well, I don't know how precise is this information. At least she mentioned about it in her books, but still there is some place of doubt that this might be some mystification or result of her imagination. Whatever, but staying in Persia was very useful for her career and for learning different styles. By the way, I discussed about her dancing style with a ballet specialist who also studied Armen Ohanian's work, Miss Nazenik Sarkisyan, and she said that according her, Armen Ohanian's dance was not full Oriental dance or not this so-called modern dance, but a combination of both styles. She performed barefoot as Isadora Duncan, the first figure among modern dancers of the beginning of 20th century, but widely using Oriental and Armenian music and elements of Persian dance. So it is something new. This mixture turned her some unique dancer that was this kind of style was novelty in the art world. So yeah, she left Persia for Constantinople, giving her dances, solo dances with violinist David Davidian in Ottoman cities, including Egyptian cities. And there is a tragic story of unresponded love of David Davidian, that after their breakup, he died from heart attack. And who knows whether it was also this fatal woman's, Armen Ohanian's, guilt in this suicide or not. Another mystery of her biography. The next, please.
Thanks. So now let's remind us that Armen Ohanian is 22 years old in 1910. And in 1911, she's invited by most empires, the most famous uh, company having 33 music hall theaters in London, to perform in London in a sketch called A Night with the Sultan, with a group called Ottoman Operetta, which were all Armenians, by the way, in London. And this sketch was based on an operetta by Dikran Chuhajian called Lebeviji Horhoraha. It was a part of the third act of that operetta. And critics raved in London, in France, and in Italy about this presentation, especially with Armen Ohanian's dance. So Armen Ohanian goes to Europe at the age of 23, totally alone, and she starts her European career. And she will become a very famous dancer in Europe in the 1910s and 1920s. So she also performed in Ireland, in Dublin, until the end of 1911, when she goes to France. Next. In France, she's best known as La Danseuse Persane, the Persian dancer, and she has a lot of events and presentations. Between 1912 and 1914, she becomes one of the most famous names on the Parisian stage, even eclipsing Mata Hari, who was at her most famous time. So at some point, of course, their styles were quite different, and Mata Hari's kind of fake Eastern Asian dance was no match for Armen Ohanian's style on one side. So she gives recitals, private presentations. She plays she also has she dances in several plays, and especially her five full house performances in December 1913, March 1914, make her famous right before a few months before the World War I will start. So she has performances both in France and in Belgium on these years. And let me mention that before England, she had performed in Austria too. So she was already a well-known name in several European countries. Yes.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, here Armen Ohanian had already a couple of love stories before getting in Paris, but her most famous love history was with Émile Bernard, a famous French painter who was friends, or at least literary friends with Van Gogh and Gauguin. And they met, they performed together at one event in March 1913, and they met, and she became Bernard's muse and lover, and she was a sitter for 2,000 of paintings during their time together between 1913 and 1915, and even Bernard published a small book with his first paintings in 1913, and they wrote together a comedy in Triage, which apparently was lost until they broke up in early 1915. As I said, the number of paintings of Bernard with Ohanian is about 2,000, not only paintings, but even a couple of several drawings, and there's even a bust. So there is a lot that she inspired him during those periods.
So he had love affairs with different people, with André Germain, Rémy de Gourmont, yeah, but also with American feminist writer Natalie Clifford Burney, who lived in Paris and was one of the main faces of Belle Époque of France. Although this affair lasted some 3 months, February, April of 1915, unfortunately, there are no photos of them together, but they both mentioned each other's names in their writings. And, because of this short affair, is being kind of exaggerated, the sexuality of Armen Ohanian, which is okay, but we cannot say that this short love story was something very, very important in her life. Am I right, Vartan?
Yes, we have, by the way, we found the letters of Ohanian to Natalie Clifford Barney. They are housed in Barney's extensive archives in Paris. And we also have Ohanian's testimony about her in her last memoir in 1931, which is a very, by the way, it's a very dismissive memoir. And we have explained extensively what was the extent of their relationship with all the data that we have so far. And as we said, somehow the fact that this has been mentioned in various sources before us in Natalie Barney's biography and other sources, it is a fact indeed. But it has been kind of blown out of proportions on the internet, where you can find dozens of websites, addressing the issue of Armen Ohanian's queerness and whatnot. When you compare to the time she was married and she was married again, and she had a lot of male lovers in between, etc., etc., it doesn't make for such a big issue. But these are the times where everything, the little thing becomes a very, very big thing out of proportion. So at this time also she was, the Toute Paris, so to speak, was about her. I mean, famous names like Paul Claudel watch her dance, and you have there Paul Claudel's poet Paul Claudel, who would be later a Nobel Prize. He wrote about her in a letter in 1915 when she watched her performing at Natalie Barney's house. And she also had performances in London and Milan, sporadic because it was the war. So in Paris there was no artistic activities, but there were outside of Paris, especially in London. Next. One of those famous people who watched her dance was obviously Rodin. who was even planning to have a sculpture of Armen Ohanian, but as far as we know, it never happened. Although Rodin was in the last years of his life, he was quite sick, so it didn't happen. But we have the correspondence of Armen Ohanian to Rodin in Rodin's archives, and we have other mentions, as you can see here. So this is not exaggeration. This is a fact that Armen Ohanian danced privately for August Rodin in 1950.
Yeah. Next.
And this is another famous Belgian sculptor, Victor Rousseau, who in 1916, when Ohanian was in London, she sat for him and he sculpted her. And this bust is called La Danseuse Persane Armen Ohanian. Is found at the Royal Museum of Fine Art in Brussels. And Rousseau wrote about her in 1920. You have here the translation of part of his text. He wrote an article about her.
Mhm. So what we can say, how we can explain this success, that, well, one can note that Armen Ohanian was a right person in right place. It was a Belle Epoque time when Orientalism was flourishing in Europe and especially in Paris. But we should note also that Armen Ohanian herself was from Orient, and Orientalism was something very natural for her. And being surrounded with this elite of Parisian bohème, being absolute favorite of French high society, she could forget her roots and her Armenian culture. But no, it was also time of big Armenian tragedy, the genocide, and there was Armenophile movement in France, and many French intellectuals were involved in this movement, writing actively and organizing events, and trying to organize some help the survivors of the genocide. And Armen Ohanian, being in Paris, could not be absent from these movements. So she participated in the biggest pro-Armenian event in Paris in April 1916, when many famous statesmen of French government were speakers, as well as many famous French art professionals. And there she recited for the first time her poem written in French, which was later translated in other languages. So 1916, she started also her writing career, we can see. So here you see the program of this event, Hommage à l'Arménie. Yes, the next one. Yeah, and a writer is born. So she's among those rare authors who fluently could write in 4 different languages. First, we see her name as an author in Russian St. Petersburg's press. It was in 1909, 1910. There are some articles about her activities in Persia and one kind of poem in prose. And later, she was an author of poems, again, mainly poems in prose. Later, short stories and biographical works, memoirs, as well as travel notes. In French, she has published five books that have been translated in different languages. Here you can see the list of languages. It's interesting that none of her books has been translated into Armenian. And after moving to Mexico, she became a Mexican writer, now writing her books in Spanish. She has published mainly small books in Spanish about the Mexican Spanish literature and art, about the Russian literature and Soviet literature. But it's interesting that having published so many serious works in French and Spanish, for her, the most dearly to her heart, there was her Armenian play that calls Irzes Gharibi, My Wish as a Migrant. Yeah. Of course, she has written also in Armenian some articles, and we cannot call her an Armenian author, but the fact that this lady who lived in foreign circles and wrote in 3 languages also never forgot her native language and produced also some works in Armenian. I jumped. Please show the list of her Spanish books.
So one mention about these books. One of these, the first one, La Danseuse de Shamakha, which was the most famous book, was also translated into several languages, as Arthur mentioned, one of them being English. There is a translation, The Dancer of Shamakha. Interestingly, that translation into English was done by Rose Wider Lane, who happened to be the ghostwriter behind the series that we probably many of you have heard of, A Little House in the Prairie. She was Rose Wider was the ghostwriter behind Laura Wilder Ingalls. So she, on her spare time as a translator, because she had to live from something, she translated, among others, Armen Ohanian's book into English. And that's the translation we have until today, which is a translation that is different from the French original in several senses, and that creates also its own kind of problems regarding the biography of Armen Ohanian, we try to address in our book. Next, please, Pablo. So Armen Ohanian was a very attractive and beautiful woman, and you know, here we have a quote that appeared in several newspapers in the US in 1920 as being a representative of the beauty of Armenian women. What we saw on the right is a picture of her, a photograph of her, which is now at the National Portrait Gallery in London. It was taken in 1912 when she was 1911, excuse me, when she was in London, and this picture appeared in the Book of Fair Women, published in 1922, an album by the famous German-British photographer Emile Hoppe, containing the pictures of 32 most beautiful women of the world. which were not at that time 100 years ago, so the two, blue-eyed and blonde women, but they were women of all parts of the world with different skin colors, different eye colors, and different hair colors, and created a lot of controversy at the time because 100 years ago there was a certain prototype of beauty for women, which was not usually, the one we are used these days, and that's why the controversy. And Ohanian was not exactly, your blonde and blue-eyed woman, but as you can see, she was a beautiful woman, anyways, and very attractive, and that's why she attracted the attention of the opposite sex too. Next. So then, after the First World War One, she stays in France, and she has recitals in Europe. She announced that she was going to retire from the stage. For a while, she interrupted her presentations in Europe. She married for the second time in Germany in 1922, Macedonio Garza, who was a Mexican journalist and a diplomat. He had entered the Mexican Foreign Service in 1921. And they got married, and she interrupted her career, and she moved. She traveled from France to Mexico, and in Mexico she gave recitals still, and she taught at the National Conservatory. She taught dance there, and then she came to New York. In 1923, she was in New York. She gave two major recitals in Midtown at the town hall, which now has disappeared. And she had presentations in other venues too, until 1925 when she returned to Europe. And she gave another recitals until 1928 in France, generally speaking, until she actually retired from the European stage in 1928 at the age of 40. And in the meantime, she traveled for the first time to now the Soviet Union after 15 years, and visited Russia after 15 years, and she gave her first visit to Soviet Armenia in 1927. And her testimony about Soviet Armenia is quite interesting because, at that time there were many travelers going back and forth between Europe and the Soviet Union, but her testimony, even though she had started to make a turn to the left, so to speak, she would become a member of the Communist Party later. At that time, she was still quite critical of the Soviet regime. It's probable that if she had been in the Soviet Union 10 years later, she would have been, caught in the Stalinist project. Next.
So, in mid-30s, she moves to Mexico with her husband, and as we remember, her daughter also lives in Mexico, and they both became activists of the Mexican Communist Party. We know that this time there were some communists from Soviet Union, including famous Lev Trotsky, who lived in Mexico. And what she can do there, her knowledge of Russian language and culture helped her to work, and she was engaged in writing and translating actively, but she never forgot her dancing profession. So she established a dance school in Mexico City. She gave recitals in Mexico and one in New York City in the beginning of 40s. But mainly, yes, publishing 5 Spanish books on Russian culture and literature, as well as studying Mexican and Spanish literature, but giving them kind of communist, interpretation. And in 1946, she published her book about Soviet Armenia, Armenia Feliz, Happy Armenia. And she appeared after so many years of absence in Paris. There are some photos of her last recitals in Paris where you see she's already of age, but still dancing in 1953. And here I should add that I met veteran artist Hagop Hagopian in Yerevan, who told me that he saw her recital in Paris in 53. So maybe the only person whom I met who has seen Armen Ohanian in life. And there is another riddle that in 58 she appeared in Soviet Armenia again and even asked the director of the Institute of Literature, Gurgen Hovnan, to give her shelter in Armenia. She would like to continue her studying Soviet literature and writing about the remained part of her life. But we know that she stayed only 48 hours in Soviet Armenia. Well, she managed to give a small part of her files, personal archive, to the Museum of Literature and Art. And why she never realized her decision to move to Soviet Union, we should just think that being a very open-minded person and very smart, what she has seen in Soviet Union, she understood that this is much more, it's far what the ideal communist society should be. Maybe. So she returned to Mexico. In 60s, she published new small books, also autobiographical, and new translations from Russian. And last time we see her in Mexican city Cuernavaca in 1967. So as Vartan already mentioned, what happened to her, we're not sure. We can guess. So the official, not official, but accepted date of her birth is 1976, maybe earlier, maybe later. This is something that we highly hope still to find out.
So we tried to find out, we tried to go over all available Armenian newspapers to see whether we could find some small notice about it, but it didn't happen. Probably because, she had, at the time, she maintained some kind of relationship in the 60s with the small Mexican Armenian community, but possibly after the early 60s that contact was cut short, and probably nobody actually learned from her death. And of course, because we don't have access to the Mexican press in the 70s. we can't find for sure whether there was any notice in the obituary published. And again, we don't, while we guess that she could have passed away in Cuernavaca, which was a sort of a refuge for retirees like Florida here, um, possibly she passed away there, but we don't know. We don't know even when her husband died, or we don't know when her daughter died. So this is still kind of a big mystery, which one day maybe it will be solved. Someone should go to Mexico and do a thorough research of all possible alternatives, but that's not, that's already a little far from our possibilities. So the interesting thing is that by the time in the 60s and 70s, of course, Armen Ohanian was mostly forgotten as a dancer, but it's in the late 80s when and the early 90s when there is a beginning of the discovery of her writings, and through her writings of her biography. I mean, to the point that people could find some kind of biographical information about her. So she starts to become more well known in the 90s, and you find some biography, you find some translation, reissues of her books in Germany, for instance, and her books translated into German were reissued in the 1990s. So afterward, there are plays, there are dance dance presentations based on her figure, and in a sense, the soil was right for a biography to come out, and this is what happened. That basically most of the great names of who surrounded her in those years of the Belle Epoque, such as Isadora Duncan, Natalie Barney, Colette, and others, all of them had their biographies. It was Armen Ohanian who was mentioned in many of them, but not profiled, because nobody had taken the task of doing that thankless job of putting together so much dispersed information. And this is what we've done in this book, and we hope that this book will be an opportunity for the reader to get acquainted with a quite extraordinary figure in our culture and on the margins of our culture, and for scholars to get deep into the information that we have provided and come up with new insights about Oriental dance, diaspora studies, gender studies, and other areas. So thank you so much for your interest, and if there are any questions, of course, we'll be more than glad to answer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vartan and Ardzvi, for that presentation. So we're going to ask that if you would like to ask questions, that you could place them in the chat area, and then I will read them to our guests. And I also want to put into the chat the places where you can get the book. And I just did that. There are 3 sources that I put: Abril Books, Nasser Books, and also the Eastern Prelacy, Armenian Prelacy bookstore, all carry this book. So while you're writing in your questions, I have a question either for Ardzvi and Vartan. So you mentioned that for a while, I guess she disappeared in a sense, right, after her death or even before. But in Armenia itself, is there today a great knowledge, or was there in the last 5 or 10 years knowledge about Armen Ohanian, or is that just something again that's coming to light with your work on her?
Well, I can say that after 2007, when our Armenian book has been published, yeah, at least those who are interested in dance history and Armenian women's history, feminism history, etc. Yeah, from time to time, many people contact me asking some details and 2 years ago, we made a short dance film, and one of our dance specialists recreated one of Ohanian's dances, and our leading modern dancer Rima Pipoyan performed it. Maybe I can share the video later of her performance. So I can say that more or less now, yes, in Armenia. But as Vartan mentioned, after her death, her name appeared in many studies especially on Oriental dance, in different languages. She was kind of icon, legend for dance historians and feminist historians, let's say. In Armenia, she might be such only now, when we will have more this biography to be published also in Armenian language one day. And I would like to remember also the performance Dear Armen that Canadian Armenian Kami Abrahamian presented also in Yerevan. So slowly, yeah, she will become more famous in Armenia, I think.
Thank you. Vartan, there's a question that could you elaborate a little bit more on the significance of Shamakha? You mentioned something about it appearing already in the 14th century, but the question is, I think just about it itself. In other words, has it made a name for itself, Shamakha, in Armenian history? And maybe a little bit about population. So just something a little bit more on the history of the place that she was born.
Shamakha existed already, in the Greek times. It was called Kamakia in Ptolemy's geography, and then in the Middle Ages, it was a part of the Persian state of Shirvanshah, and remained under the domination of Persian Khans during the Middle Ages until the Russian conquest at the beginning of the 19th century. The Armenian population there existed apparently in the early times. Shamakha was summer residence for the Armenian kings of Arwan. And of course, it's located 70 miles from Baku, and this is part of the Armenian province of Paidagaran, one of the 15 Armenian provinces of historical Armenia. So at that time, in the late ancient period, it was part of Armenia. Of course, we are not saying today that it is Armenia, but in the ancient times it was. And of course, here is where it comes in the Middle Ages mention of Shamakha as an Armenian city, which appears in the work of some European travelers. About the population, apparently it was about 60 to 70,000, but the frequent earthquakes started depopulating the city from the 17th century on. There were several thousand Armenians there, but the population, again, because of the economic decline of the city, started changing, and especially after the discovery of oil in Baku and the starting of the industrial production of oil in the 1870s. which was pioneered by Armen Ohanian, by the way. Many Armenians from Shamakha started to move to Baku, and others were going back and forth between the two cities. And this is what happened, by the way, with Armen Ohanian's family. I mean, the Budaher family was also moved at some point to Baku. We found references to her father opening a school in Baku, a private academy in 1888, the year of her birth. So we understand that they had moved to Baku, but still they were back and forth in between the two cities. And the Armenian community in Shamakhi existed practically until the 1920s or even later. The village of Zergeran, where they also had a summer house, was still populated by Armenians much later than the 1920s. But of course, all this came to an end, starting with Garapahmu in 1988, when the entire Armenian population from Azerbaijan started to be eradicated. And we know that basically today there's almost no Armenian left in Azerbaijan.
And let me add also that Shamakha or Shirvan gave to Armenian culture and the world not only Armen Ohanian, but also three eminent representatives of culture, writers Alexander Shirvanzadeh and Kostan Zaryan, as well as eminent stage director and actor Hovannes Abelian. So those four people are from Shamakha.
And the other three were cousins to each other, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you very much, Vartan and Artzvi. This has been a fascinating look into the life of this very extraordinary woman. And again, I think we have to emphasize that the role of women at that time, her role was really much greater than the role usually of women that we think of in history at that period. And so I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the book, read in detail about this very interesting woman whose career went from dance to the stage, and then traveled all over the world. And she was a writer, just a very multi-talented woman. And again, we thank Vartan and Artzvi for their years of research to bring to light some of these many new information, much new information about this wonderful woman. So thank you all for joining us today, and make sure that you can join us for our next presentation, which will be on Friday, October the 7th, when we will have our second presentation by our Kazan visiting professor, Dr. Bakhchinyan. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you then.